Welcome to another edition of Frank Islam Show. This is Frank Islam. Our guest today is Ronan Desai, a brilliant, young Indian American lawyer. I like that, and a great thinker. He's a fellow of the Truman National Security Project and also a former fellow at Belfer Center's Project on India and the subcontinent at Harvard. He writes regularly on foreign affairs, especially on U.S.-India relations, for a number of publications, including my own favorite, Huffington Post. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for coming.
Sure.
Tell us a little about your background, where you graduated from, where you came from, what are you doing, and those kind of things, so that the audience will know a little bit about your background.
Sure. No, thank you very much for having me.
Sure, you're most welcome.
So I'm originally from Orange County, California. I was born and raised on the West Coast. My parents came from India several decades ago and have made California home. I then went from Orange County to Johns Hopkins University. I did my undergraduate training in international studies. From Johns Hopkins, I then went over to Harvard University. I did a joint degree in law and public policy there. And
Harvard. Yeah, not Harvard.
Yes, no.
Okay,
Harvard.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah. So Harvard Law and the Harvard Kennedy School, and since then I've been practicing law here in Washington, D.C.
So how do you balance being a lawyer and also the public policy? Where do you get the time, and how do you balance between the two? Those are two different, totally different in terms of the profession. Tell me a little bit about that.
So ostensibly they're different. I mean, these are, on the surface two distinct areas, but what I've come to learn, and I think what others who've sort of followed the same path have seen, is that these two are very similar, and they're very related actually. And the thing I realized, when I was in school and when I did my training in law and public policy, is that these two things aren't mutually exclusive, but rather interdependent. When I would be analyzing a legal problem, it required a lot of strategic thinking and strategic analysis. And when I would be doing a public policy issue, I would have to, similarly look into law and the legal issues as well. So for me, I see them as two different sides of the same coin, and have been able to really integrate the two as a result.
Wow. As I understand, one of your expertise is U.S.-India relationship. Tell me where we are, where we're going, and what does the future hold? Sure. And also, tell me a little bit about the economic reforms that Prime Minister Singh has taken, some initiatives. And do you also believe that the GDP growth and the prosperity that India had for a long time is sustainable?
Sure, so I'll take the first one of those questions first.
Sure.
On US-India. Things are going well. I think President Obama is someone that really understands India. President Obama is someone that understands the importance of a multidimensional and robust bilateral relationship. And I think he's also someone that very much understands the fundamental values underlying that relationship.
We have a shared value and shared interest.
Shared values, shared interest. We've heard it a million times. The world's oldest and largest democracies coming together. And I think what President Obama has been able to do is really unpack that and really give some substance to this thing that we hear all the time. He's been someone, I think, that's inherited a very good relationship from his predecessor, George W. Bush. And George W. Bush inherited it from his predecessor, President Clinton. And if President Clinton was about engagement, and if President Bush was about collaboration, I think President Obama is someone that realizes that the relationship now is about partnership. And with respect to where we're going, I think that this is a relationship whose potential is unlimited. The trajectory is on an upward swing, and I think the real challenge and the real question for both the US and India is, how do you add meaning to this relationship? What are the next concrete steps? And we know, for example, that the landmark civilian nuclear deal that we saw in 2008 was really sort of the anchor of the relationship during the Bush administration. So the question that arises is, what's next? And I think there are sort of a number of things that we're going to be seeing and we're hoping to see in the bilateral relationship. One of them is going to be the US really increasing India's defense capabilities. In the strategic and defense areas, I think one of the biggest and most robust dimensions of the relationship. And I think what the two sides are really doing is making steps and working together to increase mutual defense agreements and cooperation and sort of bring that space to the next level. From the economic perspective, I think what you're going to be seeing a lot is
increasing the trade and commerce and investment.
Increasing trade, increasing commerce, increasing investment. There's been talks of a US-India bilateral investment treaty that's in the works right now. I think the next logical step and extension of that is a free trade agreement between the two countries.
Wow, FTA.
An FTA. And I think, if this is a wish list, for example, I think
it's a great wish list.
It's a great wish list.
And that'll be great if we can accomplish that during this administration.
Sure, and I think, again, the president and the folks that are advising him, and even our counterparts in India, really understand that, the potential is unlimited. It's just about being able to really execute and focus on this relationship moving forward.
I'm really pleased that it is to the next heights, and the president will take it to the next heights. Tell me a little bit about the fact that President Obama has appointed many Indian Americans in sub-cabinet job. You probably know most of them. What does the future hold for the next cabinet for the president in terms of the Indian Americans' presence in the sub-cabinet job as well as in the White House, as well as the administration?
I think what we're going to be seeing is, as of right now, President Obama has an unprecedented number of Indian Americans in the administration. And I fully expect that the next administration, his second term, which will start,
continue on that path.
It's going to continue on that path. That this is a trend, it's a durable trend, and I think it's hopefully an irreversible trend. And I think that one reflects the fact that the president really understands and values Indian American voices in the administration. Again, he understands India. He's known Indian Americans his entire life. It's been a formative relationship.
Well, if you remember, when he was in Colombia, he grew up with a lot of people from Pakistan and India.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
He knows their culture, their history, their heritage.
Sure, and he's lived abroad, and he's someone that's well-traveled. He's an Asia-Pacific president. But beyond, I think, the president's recognition of the value that these voices have, it's more of a testament to our community and how far we've come. I think my parents, who were immigrants that came, whenever they came long ago, really made the investment and the sacrifices to make sure that my generation that are...
They created a next generation.
Created a next generation that, we've done very well in medicine and engineering, and those are sort of the professions that our parents did, and that's how they got here.
Now they're getting engaged in politics.
And this is the next step, exactly.
Good.
And the number of young Indian Americans is just going to proliferate. It's going to continue, and I think, again, it's a real acknowledgement of how far our community has come in really being a part of the political fabric of the country.
Well, that's great that the president has recognized their talent, their skills, their experience, and they will be part of the American society. So that's a great thing. They have a lot to contribute to American society. So the United States is going to withdraw from Afghanistan.
Yes.
And it may withdraw it earlier than what he expected. Mr. Karzai is in the White House today, and they probably have a joint conference as we speak right now. Where the relationship is headed, and do you believe that Taliban will have upper hand if the United States does leave? What about the fears of India in terms of the Taliban taking over Afghanistan after the United States leaves? What's your thoughts on that?
Here's what we know for sure. We know that both the United States and India want to make sure that whenever it is U.S. troops leave, that Afghanistan does not return to being an area or a country which is a staging ground for attacks against both the U.S. and India. The larger questions that arise, obviously, is what's the scope and the character of the withdrawal going to look like? And as you pointed out, President Karzai is with President Obama right now. They're beginning negotiations and talks about sort of the character and the dimensions of the withdrawal, and it's to be seen. Now, the U.S. is hoping for a best-case scenario, or India is hoping for a best-case scenario that, once they leave, that the country will be somewhat stable, hoping for a Jeffersonian-type democracy, which may have been the goal 7 or 8 years now. I think there's been some realism in the government right now that's not going to happen. If we can make sure that Afghanistan, at the very minimum, does not return to being a threat.
A totalitarian society.
Sure, and posing a threat to its neighbors and posing a threat to the U.S., I think that's something that's realistic, something that's well within the future of potentially happening. Now, there's a lot of different moving parts for that to happen. That's assuming that President Karzai can be an able and effective ruler. That assumes that the Afghan forces that we have spent so much money and time to train, that they are up for the task. The corruption is going to be taken care of, that the economics of the country are going to be strong and heading in the right direction. I think a combination of these factors is really what we're going to have to look at to get it right. And at the very least, make sure Afghanistan does not return to what it was before the 9/11 attacks.
What will be the effect of the withdrawal as far as Pakistan is concerned? That's my first question. My second question is the relationship between India and Pakistan. It is an interest of India that the Pakistan is secure, safe, and democratic.
Yes.
And they can promote the trade. So the third question of mine is, where the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan is headed, and what's going to happen with the U.S. Not the Indian-Pakistan relationship.
Right. So with respect to the withdrawal in Pakistan, here's what we want. We want a stable Pakistan. It is in the interest
It is in our interest
of every party involved for
Yes.
Pakistan to be stable. And we've heard various administration officials say multiple times that the key to the AFPAC puzzle lies with Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. That really what happens in that area is affected by what the Pakistanis do in that region. Now, once the withdrawal happens, I think Pakistan's going to face a question for itself. And it's a very simple question. And that question is, do they want to be a source of stability or a source of instability? And we know that Pakistan has relationships with terrorist elements, with extremists in the past, that they've supported them, that they've cultivated them, that Pakistan in the past has used radical elements as instruments of their foreign policy, that they've exported this extremism across both their borders. And that hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for the Americans, it hasn't worked for the Indians, but most importantly, it hasn't worked for the Pakistanis. And what we're seeing over the last few years is that
Pakistan has become a victim of that violence.
they've become a victim of those same extremist elements.
Exactly.
I mean, just a couple days ago, we saw 120, 130 people were killed in coordinated attacks across the country. And these terrorist attacks against the civilians of Pakistan, the people of Pakistan, have become more and more frequent, more and more common. And I think hopefully that would be a wake-up call to the Pakistanis. Now, with respect to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, that's a policy that, of course, is something that poses a huge challenge for our government. How do we, make them an ally on the war against terror, but make sure that they don't distinguish between good Taliban and bad Taliban, good extremists and bad extremists? And I think what the U.S. needs to do, and we've seen sort of the ups and downs of that relationship. It's been quite tumultuous over the past few years, especially with the discovery of Osama bin Laden being in Pakistan and other types of things, is to impress upon them, look, forget our interests, forget the Indian interests, this is in your interest.
Exactly.
It is in your interest to be a source of stability, to be a regional leader in this area, and to really contribute to the stability and long-term growth of Afghanistan.
And be part of the global economy.
And be part of the global economy, and again, be a responsible stakeholder in what's happening there. And if the past is any indication of the future, the Pakistanis should hopefully realize that the course that some in their government have pursued have not paid rich dividends for them. With regards to U.S.-India, that's a sort of
India-Pakistan.
India-Pakistan, that's a perennial question. And just this past week, we saw that there was an escalation in Kashmir.
There's a little bit thaw.
There's been a thaw, absolutely.
In the relationship.
There's been a thaw through the trade regime, through
Yes.
Through other peace processes. But just as quickly as a thaw can happen, we see something like the killings in Kashmir of the Pakistani and Indian soldiers happen, which can jeopardize the process. Now, I'm cautiously optimistic that I think both governments in both countries are very committed to the peace process. They're committed to having good relationships with one another. The thing that I found striking was even after these horrific killings took place over the line of control.
There's still dialogue going on with the two.
Yes, both Hina Rabbani Kaur, the foreign minister of Pakistan, as well as a number of senior Indian officials also said that this is reprehensible, it has to be addressed, but we cannot let this derail the larger trajectory of India-Pakistan relations and the peace process that is slowly developing. So I think cautious optimism is warranted. It's sort of rolling a multi-sided die. One of these days you might get it right.
We want to take a break.
Great.
I want to take a break, and we'll be right back. Thank you very much. Let's go back to the discussion that we have about India. So there's a concern that the Indian economy is not living up to the promises of the early 2000s. Is India on the wrong track economically? And what effects will have the economic reform the Prime Minister Singh has instituted? Is the GDP growth that India has for the last 4 or 5 years, is that sustainable?
I think it's very easy to look at India's economic growth with both irrational exuberance and irrational despair. And what we're seeing happening now is, yes, HSBC, I think, revised their estimate for India's GDP growth from 5.7% to 5.2%. This made headlines on the front page of every business section all over the world. But it's important to keep this within context and to sort of look at the growth rate relative to what it's been. In the past, it's been remarkable, and India's a BRIC country. Everyone was betting on India's economic future. I think it was only inevitable to a certain extent that that was going to slow down a bit. Now, 5% growth relative to the rest of the world, which is going through a global recession, even compared to the US economy, is still robust. I mean, it's still quite good. Not as good as it used to be, but it's still pretty decent.
It's still pretty decent.
That being said, I think India is very aware that it needs to take steps to get back to where it was. President Obama and others regionally and internationally have really put pressure on India to begin enacting and initiating certain reforms that can jumpstart India's economy again. Second level reforms with respect to the ones that have already been instituted, structural reforms, FDI. India has allowed FDI to come into the country. It's very politically controversial, but these are the steps that India can take to really move that engine of economic growth forward. I think with existing FDI, for example, India needs to increase the caps of the ones that are allowed, the ones that they don't allow in certain sectors. It's time for them to do that. India's led the global economy for a few years now because of its innovation and human capital and other resources. But again, I think with the reality setting in a bit, if India wants to maintain that, to stay ahead of the curve, it's time to really initiate these reforms. Manmohan Singh is the prime minister. He's a brilliant economist. He was the figure responsible for India's economic reforms back in the early 90s. In 1991, he was the architect of India's economic policy. So to have someone of his stature and his experience there, the country needs to really take advantage of that and put their growth back on the right track. 5.2% is not great, but compared to what it's been in other places of the world, I guess we'll take it.
Ours, it's one of the, our growth is, I understand, 3.2%. 2.7 and 3.2.
It's less than 3%, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
but our economy is,
Sure.
is a lot, different than India's economy. It's a developed economy.
And look, India's created the largest middle class in the world because of its economic growth.
And they'll continue to buy our products and services. So having India create the middle class, which is close to about 300 million people, they will be the right partner for us to sell our products and services.
Absolutely.
So the perception in this country is that the Indian Americans are a formidable lobbying force, and I'm not sure you're lobbying it, but that's all right. The good example in the George W. Bush administration, the 2002 U.S. nuclear deal. Are they really formidable? What exactly they're doing? And tell us a little bit about shed some light on this, their effort, what they're doing, and have they been successful?
Sure. The U.S.-India nuclear deal and the dynamics surrounding that, I think, was a very powerful demonstration back in 2005 and 2006 of...
They all came together.
Of what the community can do together.
Yes.
It was a very potent force and was very responsible for really changing the fundamental trajectory of U.S.-India relations. And I worked on helping get approval for that deal. And I witnessed firsthand the immense power that can be harnessed if we come together towards a singular cause. And seeing folks from around the country literally put their differences aside and work towards a common goal was something that was unprecedented. And if you remember the New York Times, the Washington Post, I mean, the community had really arrived at that time. It put into sharp focus what we could do. Now, that being said, what I haven't seen since that time is the community get together like that again, with Indian Americans coming together with the same level of engagement or enthusiasm for issues that affect our community. And as a community in this country, we have a myriad of issues that affect us, whether it's civil rights, immigration, tech policy, business policy. And I'm waiting for us to get back together and to really, one, identify those interests, articulate those interests as they relate to us. We're like any other citizen in this country where we have interests that affect us as a community. And really going back and harnessing that same potential, harnessing that same power to identify those interests, but then to pursue them. And to really say, we are citizens of this country, issues here affect us, and we're going to come together and pursue those interests. So on the one hand, we've done it before. It was unprecedented. It was one of the most satisfying things to witness that firsthand. But I think since then, we've slacked a little bit. And I think it's imperative for us to come back together and really make this a sustainable thing and ensure that we're not a one-issue community.
Makes a lot of sense to me. You talk about the Indian Americans. They have been adequately represented in a lot of professions. They have done a very good job in terms of being doctors and engineers and the entrepreneurs and business community. But you don't really see their representation as much in countries' foreign policy. They also have done a good job in terms of the public policies. Tell us a little bit about why is that?
I think Secretary Clinton at the State Department gets a lot of credit in that she's done a very good job of bringing in a lot of Indian Americans to the State Department. And aside from the executive branch, even on Capitol Hill now with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we're seeing an increasing number of Indian Americans playing a very prominent role in foreign policy. Richard Verma was the Assistant Secretary of Legislative Affairs. Rajiv Shah is still the Director of USAID. Yep, Raj Shah, has a multi-billion-dollar budget, cabinet-level position. There are others on the Hill, Sajid Gandhi and others, who are very, I think, visible in their roles in the spaces in which they work in. So on the one hand, I'm inclined to say, relative to what it was, we're seeing an increasing number of Indian Americans in foreign policy playing, I think, a very critical role in this country's diplomacy. That being said, I think it's important that this trend continues to grow. And what I would like to see is more and more Indian Americans, young Indian Americans, coming to the government saying, I want to do foreign policy. And as you pointed out, we've done very well in other areas and other disciplines. I think individually as well. I mean, you name the field or the profession, and Indians have excelled in medicine, engineering, sure, but in aerospace, in space itself, the first Indian astronauts, in the legal profession, Sri Srinivasan, who is the number 2 in the Solicitor General's office.
Yeah, I understand he's going to be nominated for the
He's been nominated for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and I'm sure in our lifetimes, maybe for the Supreme Court. He's a brilliant young man. We're seeing folks in business and entrepreneurship like yourselves, and even younger ones up and coming, who are really excelling at what they're doing. The folks that are making millions on Wall Street are Indian American. The folks that are prosecuting those ones making millions if they've broken the laws are also Indian American. Nobel Prize winners. So from an individual level, I think the community has excelled. They're ubiquitous in every field. Ami Bera has just been elected to the U.S. Congress, the third Indian American in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Yeah. And by the way, he's from California.
From my home state of California.
Yes.
He's from our northern counterpart. Again, he's someone, the first Democrat, in 50 years. So the trend is good, and it's moving in the right direction, but we want to see more of it. And we want to see Indian Americans doing more, participating more, and again, for my parents' generation to tell their kids, and to me to tell my kids that it's okay for you to do this. We encourage it. We want you to be a part of this fabric of American society. I mean, this country's very used to now seeing Indian Americans as their physicians, or their tech person, or their engineers, or their IT person. And what we're looking forward to having is that in a few years, it's utterly unremarkable.
Exactly.
That they're members of Congress, or that they're entrepreneur, whatever it may be, to see Indian Americans really be represented across a spectrum and across a wide variety of different things.
Well, you guys, people like yourself, are planting the seed, and the seed will grow and prosper. So we can harvest that.
We've benefited from your generation.
Yeah, we benefited from America's generosity.
Yes.
And America's kindness.
Yes,
We have been beneficiary of that.
And what's interesting is only in America. I mean, we hear this all the time, the American dream. And on the one hand, this has happened a million times in this country, but it can only happen in this country.
It reaffirms the notion that this is a great country.
Absolutely.
Now, when I introduced to you, I talked to you a little bit about, I told the audience about you are a fellow of Truman National Security Project. Tell us a little bit about that. What is this Truman National Security Project, and what is it? What does it do?
So the Truman National Security Project is a leadership institute and really a think tank that's aiming to train the next generation of foreign policy professionals and educate them and collaborate together. And they espouse a certain number of values of foreign policy, progressive values that they believe are consistent with the founding principles of the country. And really, their aim is to implement a vision of U.S. foreign policy practice abroad that is aligned with what we're trying to accomplish and what our ends and objectives are. So we have a class of fellows every year, which has been increasing over the last several years, which is involved with in every major area of U.S. foreign policy, whether it's the government, think tanks, NGOs, nonprofits, private practice like myself.
Is it based on the President Truman's name?
It's based on President Truman's name, who's really an inspiration through example to us for someone who was a transformational figure in foreign policy. And this notion that...
And this is located where?
Here in Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
Based here in the Washington area, but there's chapters across the country.
Okay.
There are chapters in every major city, and it's really grown to become a very formidable force in the foreign policy conversation and dialogue of this nation. They exist all over, and the role that they've played in really moving the country towards a vision of foreign policy that the Truman Project believes is the right one, I think has been absolutely critical.
That's great that they're moving our nations forward. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate that very much. And good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
This is our show. Have a nice week.